One of the biggest stories of 2019 is the impact of big tech on our daily lives. So right here in D.C., multiple tech leaders have been taken to task by congressional officials for lacking best practices and proper scrutiny. So a recent piece in Jacobin magazine gives a blueprint for, quote, decommodifying and democratizing the internet.
Called A Socialist Plan for the Internet, the piece provides a new approach to managing Google, Facebook, and other platforms. Joining us now via Skype is founding editor of Logic Magazine and Jacobin contributor Ben Tarnoff. He tells us about a simple three-step plan for fixing the internet the socialist way. Thanks so much, Ben. It was a great piece, really fascinating.
Hey, thanks so much for reading it.
All right, so you lay out basically most of the ideas for dealing with big tech have come from, the sort of antitrust part of the left. What would a socialist approach look like that would be different from those approaches?
Yeah, great question. So as you mentioned, really the cutting edge of the tech regulation conversation is dominated by the antitrust community. So folks at the Open Markets Institute, for instance. And these ideas have found a lot of popularity in certain precincts of the Democratic Party. Elizabeth Warren, in particular, has been very enthusiastic about the antitrust approach. And in general, the antitrust folks are looking for ways to make markets work better. So they have a variety of tools in their toolkit to try to do that, breaking big firms up into smaller firms, enforcing stricter regulation of the bigger firms. And what I lay out in my piece is that I think socialists have a lot to learn from the antitrust community. We have a lot of tools that we can draw on that community is putting out into the public conversation, but that our objectives are actually pretty different. That instead of wanting to make markets work better, we generally want to shrink markets. We want to make markets mediate less of our lives, make them less central to our survival and our flourishing. So in my piece, I try to lay out a few ideas for how we might begin to do that with the internet.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, Ben, I do hand it to you, which is just that you just say, instead of breaking it up, why not just take it over? What would that entail ultimately in terms of collectivizing the internet? That is government control. So how would that control be implemented? And what is the real benefit of that? I mean, that doesn't sound like what the very purpose of the internet itself was about decentralizing power and democratizing power. And this sounds like consolidating the very thing that gives people like you, Jacobin, this show, the very power in order to voice dissenting ideas.
Well, as you say, I think some of the ideas around the creation of the internet was to create a more distributed model of networking. In fact, as we know, since the privatization of the internet in the mid-90s, a very consolidated model has emerged. We have a handful of big private firms controlling both the physical infrastructure of the internet and, of course, the digital infrastructures of the internet, like Facebook, Google, and so on. So what I lay out in the piece is if we want to think about democratizing the internet, we first have to break it up into a couple of different pieces. The internet is obviously a very, very complicated system. And I think those two pieces that we could start to think about are broadly the pipes on the one hand and the platforms. So the pipes are how you get broadband service at home, Comcast, Verizon, AT&T, and so on. This is the physical infrastructure of the internet that is devoted to sending packets of data from one place to another. It's how you get emails, it's how you access Twitter, and so on. And for that portion of the internet, we know that public ownership works at a variety of levels. To give you a good example, in Chattanooga, Tennessee, for years, they've had a very successful experiment with municipal broadband, where the local city-owned electric utility, EPB, functions as a local ISP and serves broadband to communities throughout Chattanooga for very low costs, very high speeds, and can really outcompete the private telecoms in that area. So municipal broadband, to give you a concrete example, is one model we could think about for public ownership of the pipes of the internet.
Yeah, so but again, though, what you're talking about there is distribution. That's no more simple. I mean, that's no more differentiated than private road or public roads as a utility itself. I think I'm talking much more about the companies and the user experience. Tell us about, you've talked about collectivize. So would it be a collectivized ownership of social media, of streaming platforms? I mean, how does this go exactly?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think what you're indicating is where things get a little bit more difficult and maybe a little bit more interesting is when we move further up the stack, right? So the physical infrastructure of the internet, I think we could run as a publicly owned public utility fairly easily, different sizes of public entities, but public ownership would make sense as a model. When we move further up the stack to the so-called platforms, social media, let's say Uber, Airbnb, streaming, it becomes more complex because there are so many different kinds of services that we're talking about here. So in the piece, I say that a big portion of the work we need to do is to better taxonomize the different types of services that belong to this area of the internet. We have this word platform, for instance. You hear the platform word thrown around a lot. In the piece, I argue that platforms really don't exist. There's no one single thing we can call a platform. So part of this work is actually analytical. And what I argue is once we break down these different services or platforms into different clusters on the basis of a few different factors, say how many users they have, what kind of function they perform, what kind of power they exercise, then we can think of models of decommodification, of democratization that are suited to particular clusters.
So let's talk specifically about social media companies, which is certainly generating the most sort of heat in this town. And I think around the country, there's a lot of concern about privacy issues, about the way that Facebook and Twitter have influence in our elections. They're able to sanction and deplatform certain viewpoints that they see as out of bounds, whether you agree with that or not. Like, how do you deal specifically with a company like Facebook?
Facebook is a great example because, as you said, it probably is at the center of the public conversation. So it's something that we should think about probably first in this model. One of the ideas that has emerged from the antitrust community is enforcing interoperability with social media platforms like Facebook.
Right.
In other words, they would have to have open and transparent standards where other services could freely interoperate with Facebook. And in the piece, I propose that this is an exciting model that we could use to think about shrinking the power of Facebook and making it possible for instance, open source alternatives to interoperate with Facebook. So you could start to think about Facebook less as a service and more as a data backbone, as essentially an entity that has our social graphs, that has information about who we're friends with and what kind of things we like, but that there's a diversity of different services, many of which are open source or perhaps operated on a cooperative basis, that can interoperate with that social media backbone. I think that's a nice model for thinking about how to significantly constrain the power of a big private firm like Facebook.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
A lot of food for thought there, complicated problem. Thank you so much for digging into it for us.
Thanks, Ben. Great conversation.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
And we'll have more Rising for you right after this.